the pathos of the whole the saga of this community that's homeless. So I think it's in many ways it will be it's entered history now. It's part of the record books, and it is there, documented now to some extent. Although the sample size is small, nonetheless, it's able to, in many ways, convey the general condition of these people who've been exiled and what are the prospects for them, what they're going through. So in many ways, it's a kind of a people's history. That's how I like to see this in vivid lens and camera.
Mr. Knight, just a quick reaction to the book itself. What did you think when you?
I must first make a confession. I think I'm just a researcher, not a lawyer. My books are taught in a few law schools, but that's because I constantly am attempting to bring due process and have a very good familiarity with the law without having professionally trained in it. Let me now turn to the book. I think the book, when I glanced through the pictures, I was really struck by the sensitivity and the acuity in terms of the photographer lens and the mind process that went behind taking that particular picture. And I hope it does sensitize Delhi's cognoscenti to the reality of what it means to be a non-citizen, to live in a twilight zone. Because even the poorest Indian citizen has certain access to due process, which the refugee does not have. And he or she is that much more vulnerable. I think the photographer, Shivani in this case, has brought out the plight and the pathos of the refugees' everyday life very, very starkly. And I do hope it hits you somewhere, hopefully in the gut and the heart, but perhaps even deeper, that it embeds itself in your consciousness and your subconsciousness more so, and perhaps in helping the Chin community, the fellowship, and their leadership in trying to access some of the rights that we give to ourselves being citizens. Traditionally, the Indian has been very wonderful with the refugee. There are innumerable stories, historical, folklore, mythology. I shan't go into it only for reasons of time and brevity. But this is not necessarily reflective of state policy. And this is where the citizen, unless he or she tries to bridge that gulf and bring in public consciousness to bear on executive and government and legislative policy, changes will not happen to make India a more sensitive country. And finally, that is the hallmark of a much more civilized society, how we treat those who are less fortunate than us. Thank you.
And Mr. Knight, we're going to talk about some of the sort of solutions that have been put out there, whether they're actually practical given the kind of limitations that we've seen in the current existing framework. I'm still trying to get some reactions in terms of how it was perceived, because I know how I react to the book. We've seen how someone who's come from a very academic sort of background has talked about it, a publisher. Of course, Mr. Rao has been talking to, who's been working extensively with human rights. I have Rosalind with me, and I also have Alian with me, and you're representative of the Chin community. So it's really important for me to actually understand what you thought when you saw some of those images. Because Shivani has actually said she's captured families, she's captured narratives. Obviously, there's a lot more in the story that can still be said, but she has really spent a bit of time trying to just open up that lens, open up the mind in terms of what it means. So what did you think when you took a look at the book?
Yeah, I just glanced at the book and I saw pictures. Most of them I have seen the people, and I know their hardships. So it is when I saw those pictures, I feel like crying, because these pictures comes out from their real experience. not just as facial photos and pictures, but out of that hardships and in a very difficult situation, these pictures shows I see through their heart, their difficulties. So it is very heart touching, and I feel very sad. But I thank the publication for exposing these things.
Sure.
Thank you.
Rosalind, a few quick thoughts on some of the images. And as Leon also pointed out, he knows a lot of these families. For me, I'm looking at it, as a human connect, but you actually know these relationships. In fact, I think it's a good idea for this book to actually be circulated a little bit because not everybody has had a chance to see it. So if someone would not just mind, should I just come up here and just pass it around? Because we're all friends and family.
There's a book wrapped in paper.
It is, you know that, but you should take a look at it. Just take a quick glance so that people know what we're talking about, isn't it?
When I saw the book for the first time, I was very surprised, and it was a pleasant surprise because despite of the Chins having sought refuge in India for more than 2 decades, we have not seen a book being published on Chin refugees from a person who is not working on refugees. We have had a lot of reports from people who have worked on the Chin refugees, but not from a person whose work is not directly related to Chin refugees. So it is a very encouraging sign, and I would like to thank everyone who has been a part of making this book possible on behalf of the whole Chin community here in New Delhi. As you all are probably aware, India is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. It deals with refugees on an ad hoc basis, and unfortunately the Chins are not the group favored by the Indian government. And the situations that we have been going through for over 2 decades have been really difficult, really horrible, if I may say so. And though if you go through the pictures, if you go through the book, you will see the kind of hardships and the struggles that the Chins have to go through here in India. But on the inside, it also brings out in public. It also makes the whole experiences, the whole struggles that the Chins have to go through in the eyes of you all people who I believe will be able to do something to help the Chins here in India. So I think we can discuss more later on, but this is my reaction as a Chin.
This is your reaction. So let's talk about some of the sort of practical issues at hand here. Sriram, we were having a sort of informal discussion before all of this started, before this evening started. You sort of talked about this whole issue of being stateless. Now I know that's a very complicated issue. We can go on and on about it, but one of the biggest problems with rights, of course, is that you need to have a proper. There has to be a structure. There has to be some kind of belonging, because without that you cannot have the rights that one requires. You also briefly talked about how perhaps the so-called democratization that's going to be taking place in Burma, whether there's going to be any kind of impact on the on the community itself over here. Just give me some of your thoughts as someone who's following policy, who's looked at the refugee issue.
Yeah, Burma is undergoing some kind of political liberalization. So Burmese state structure is very, very majoritarian, unitarian, is supposed to be on its way, at least in transition, towards some kind of democracy. It's possible Aung San Suu Kyi may actually run for presidency and win if they amend the constitution before next year's elections. So, and she, of course, as a beacon of democracy and a spokesperson for a more liberal arrangement within Burma, has been conciliated towards the ethnic minorities, including the Chin. There have been breaches in this, especially when it comes to the Rohingyas and the anti-Muslim violence that's been turned up by some of these movements, fundamentalist Buddhist movements in Burma. But I think she's definitely committed to this cause. But then, of course, one has to think deeper about social attitudes towards minorities and what will happen to people when potentially they go back. In fact, most long-term protracted refugee communities take a long while before attempting the trek back, or what we call repatriation in the jargon. That's because they're not sure about the security and of person, as well as about whether they can recreate the communities that have been broken up over 20 or 30 years of flight and migration. So I think the state is in a way a necessary evil, right? Because that's how we have conceived of it. But at the same time, it imposes all these terrible calamities on individuals and human beings who are unable to cope with these brutal structures.
Okay, so I mean, I understand what you're saying there, and I have a feeling that Mr. Mnai really wants to come in on that, but we'll go. But before I come to you, Mr. Mnai, I just want to talk to Rosalind about this as well. That do you feel that there are going to be any sort of changes in the short term that will perhaps have some kind of impact? Because we're also going to be discussing the immediate needs of the community over here. I mean, we're talking about basic needs here. I mean, whether it's sanitation or health and education, all of that is there. But is there something that gives you some kind of hope in the future that things could change?
Before we talk about the big picture, since we are since we are talking about the Chins, most of the Chins have to flee to neighboring countries, including India, because of persecution, and also because of a lot of human rights violations taking place within Chin state. And human rights violations are perpetrated by the Burmese army. And now the Chin National Front, the armed group that we have in Chin state, have signed a ceasefire deal with the government. But despite of that, we have not seen the army being moved out of Chin state. Before the ceasefire, before the so-called transformation, or before the so-called reform, we have 14 battalions in Chin state, more than 50 army camps in Chin state. And all of the problems come from the Burmese army. And despite of all these so-called reforms, we still have the same number of battalions and the same number of Burmese army. And the same kind of patterns, the same human rights violations are taking place. So if you ask a normal person, if you ask a civilian in Chin state, have you seen or have you felt or have you, do you have hope about the reforms or about the positive changes? He's probably going to say no, because he doesn't see so, he doesn't feel so, he doesn't see any hope coming right away. And if I may add, especially now, after the 2010, now that we have a quasi-civilian government in Burma, a lot of people are shifting their attention inside Burma. And it might be right so, but on the other hand, it's good to look at the big picture, but thousands and thousands are suffering on the ground while they are in the neighboring countries as refugees. And are we not human enough that you will look at the big picture and neglect all our needs as humans? When we talk about needs, it's not about having luxury, having the rights. It's only about having daily needs, daily necessities.
Daily needs. I mean, we're talking about daily needs. On the other hand, this time we're talking about some initiatives that perhaps could work. Also, why does it really work in anyone's favor to have some kind of sane policy on refugees, something that can actually help these people? I mean, we've talked about the fight for their own survival. As somebody who's worked in this space for a very long time, what are your thoughts on that? Because, at the end of the day, we've looked at some of the confused messages that have come out of administrations as well. I'm not quite sure if that's going to change, but I'm just saying that generally. I mean, this is a very complicated issue. What do you have to say about that?
Well, we have a policy which is marked by the fact that there is no policy, by its absence. We have a 1939 order, a 1946 order, and a 1948 order, all going back into some primeval past. There's nothing that reflects the fundamental rights enshrined in the Indian Constitution, in the preamble, and chapter 2 and 3 of the Constitution, which should have imbued or should have informed any new legislation on this. It's absolutely essential that India crafts a domestic legislation to differentiate between political refugee, economic migrant, a transient migrant, historically demographic fluxes and changes that take place. None of that seems to be there in the public debate, in the policy-making framework. And so we are still doing episodic and knee-jerk reactions every time, yelling and mumbling and grumbling, but not looking at any of the root causes. Now, one of the things that the Chins clearly bring out is there is no way you can deal with a difficult situation in Burma. Just because there's been an election does not mean that Burma has become democratic. The ethnic minorities, the Chins, the Kachins, the Shan, the Karens, in spite of the ceasefire agreements, are facing very serious problems. Traditionally, India has been sympathetic to them. In fact, in the old days, we had a Karen language broadcast from All India Radio, which is extremely widely heard, apart from the Burmese language broadcast. Until Rajiv Gandhi's tenure, there was a genuine humanitarian and a forward-looking policy on looking at refugees and democratic sentiments and sensitivities in Burma with greater acuity. Since then, there has been a jettisoning of that in the name of real politics, but it has not really helped us, because while the Delhi press has not reported, the Burmese army actually occupied a few villages for a few months, not for a few days, in Manipur. They continue to do a lot of other little funny business, including aiding drug trafficking and illegal trafficking. It's not insurgent groups alone. The Burmese army is hail fellow well met with all the drug traffickers straight all the way from Kunming to Arunachal and to Manipur and etc. I think the Indian government needs a little bit of shoestring pulling on the need to look at this policy a little bit better. At the Chins here, please understand, I'll end with this, the problem is very acute in Delhi with the Chin refugees, but it's even more acute for those in Mizoram. Because while Chins in Delhi have some amount of sustenance with help from Indian community organizations or the UNHCR, which is trying to do a difficult job in a very difficult situation, unless UNHCR is given access to Chin state, the hostility of the local Mizos to the Chin is very, very acute. The condition of them in Champai, in Salai, is to be seen to be believed. So unless there is much more sensitivity from all of you who represent certain decision-making quarters in Delhi, I think what is not seen in Delhi is not on the screen at all for the policymaker. And that's where not just the Chin, but a range of other marginalized people fall between the cracks. And here the cracks don't just remain cracks, but they actually constrict. Thank you.
No, thank you. And in fact, thank you for bringing up this point, because one of the things in fact the book also tells us is that we're looking at a population over here that's about 8,000 to 9,000 members of the community. But when we look at the Northeast, the numbers are manyfold. And in fact, in an earlier discussion I was having with Rosalind before all of us came into this room, I was asking, I said, what is the kind of experience that someone from the Chin community has, say you are in Mizoram, versus what's happening here in Delhi? One of the things she pointed out to me is that in order for her, for protection, is this attempt towards assimilation, and to try not to draw attention to yourself as well. I mean, that's how vulnerable the community feels, even in an environment where you have travel connections, where you have it's quite a scary place. Can you tell me a little bit more? Because I'm sure you know a lot of people that have sort of spent time there, some people who may be resisting going there. Just give me an example as to comparative stories that you've heard.
As Mr. Ravi Nair has said, the UNHCR does not have access in Mizoram, and more than 70,000 Chin refugees are estimated to be in Mizoram right now. And all of them are without documents, without any kind of documents. So they have to be invisible. When I say invisible, you have to assimilate yourself into the Mizo society. On the other hand, we are quite lucky that we share similar culture, similar physical appearances, etc. And we have been, we have had some historical connections with the Mizos. So if you can assimilate yourself with the Mizo society, you may be safe, because you can then pass off as a Mizo, and then you may not be subjected to deportations. And we have seen a lot of deportations. The last mass deportation took place almost 9 years ago. Hundreds and hundreds of Chins from Mizoram were deported. And we also have seen whenever the Chins in Mizoram are the pawns for the political games, if I may say so. If I may give one example, last year there was a Chin village being burnt down by the whole one Mizo village. And when I say Chin village, it's just a group of Chin farmers settling in one place near a Mizo village. And since they are not wanted there, the Mizo went and burnt the whole village and burnt down about 40 to 50 households. Everything was burnt down except a school and a church. And the police men were deployed there by the government, but they were there watching the whole thing taking place without helping the Chin refugees, without helping the Chins. And later on they had a truce between the Chin refugees and the locals. And the condition was that the Chins will not speak about this incident to anyone. They will not tell this to any media person, and that if they do so, they will be left out.
So keep quiet.
Keep quiet, yeah. So the whole village being burnt down, and yet no news have come out, and nobody knew. The whole world doesn't know about this.
So there's exploitation that's going on even behind the scenes, and the kind of, there's a lot of lack of awareness anyway about, even in Delhi, about what's happening in the northeast by itself. But within that, you're pointing to the larger problem. One of the points that has come up again and again with issues of the Chin community is that language, of course, has been a barrier. Education, of course, is stunted because, where do these kids go? And apparently the government schools are, to a certain point, they can gain access, but after that there's no question of higher education. Another issue, of course, has been skills. But those skills that are coming up, who is there to sort of employ them? Because apparently there have been initiatives such as teaching tailoring or jewelry, things that, but